Hi freshmen, it's Miss Matthews. This video is for chapter 1 of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. And what is going to happen is I will read the chapter out loud. I will stop periodically and sort of explain what's happening and also point out certain details to you in the text. And the expectation is that you are listening and reading along, so you're actually looking at your book. And when I stop and explain stuff or point out details to you, you should be writing that down. You should be annotating that in your actual book. So in the margins, up in the blank space, or just use Post-it notes to sort of jot down what I'm saying. The purposes of this is to model for you how to annotate. So annotation has a purpose. It actually has a few different purposes. When you're annotating, you're interacting with the text. You're interacting with what you're reading instead of just sort of passively consuming it. And what that means is you can sort of annotate for different reasons. Perhaps you're annotating to summarize, to just figure out what's happening and paraphrase it in your own words. We can also annotate to react, to ask yourself, how do I feel or think about what I'm reading? What are my opinions? How can I bring my own sort of life experience to that? You can annotate to connect. That means you are recognizing familiar things in the text that remind you of other things you've read or watched or experienced or know about life. And then you can annotate to analyze. That's sort of the next level. That's where you're breaking apart the writing and you're trying to get inside the author's brain and figure out why they wrote it the way they wrote it. Why did they choose those words? Why did they choose those details? And can we see any pattern to the writing style? So as I'm reading, I'll stop and I'll sort of do those things. I'll summarize, I'll react, I'll connect, and I'll analyze. And you follow along, you make the notes in your book, and then eventually you'll be able to do this on your own. Okay, so here we go. Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, Chapter 1. A few miles south of Soledad, the Salinas River drops in close to the hillside bank and runs deep and green. The water is warm, too, for it has slipped twinkling over the yellow sands in the sunlight before reaching the narrow pool. On one side of the river, the golden foothill slopes curve up to the strong and rocky Gabilan Mountains. But on the valley side, the water is lined with trees, willows fresh and green with every spring, carrying in their lower leaf junctures the debris of the winter's flooding, and sycamores with mottled white recumbent limbs and branches that arch over the pool. On the sandy bank under the trees, the leaves lie deep and so crisp that a lizard makes a great skittering if he runs among them. Rabbits come out of the brush to sit on the sand in the evening, and the damp flats are covered with the night tracks of coons and with the spread pads of dogs from the ranches and with the split-wedged tracks of deer that come to drink in the dark. There is a path through the willows and among the sycamores, a path beaten hard by boys coming down from the ranches to swim in the deep pool, and beaten hard by tramps who come wearily down from the highway in the evening to jungle up near water. In front of the low horizontal limb of a giant sycamore, there is an ash pile made by many fires. The limb is worn smooth by men who have sat on it. So in that very first paragraph, we have a very natural setting being described, a lot of nature details about the water, about the scenery, about the mountains, the kind of trees that grow there, about some of the wildlife that's around. We have lizards and rabbits and the tracks of different raccoons and dogs and deer, okay? And if I were to react to this and sort of say, what's the mood? Like, how would it feel to be in this location? It seems very serene. It seems very pretty. It seems very calm and peaceful. So it's almost like a movie to me, sort of setting the scene, right? The camera's panning across this natural setting and giving me a sense of the scene. And then in the second paragraph, we have this path that's mentioned, that's beaten hard by all the people who have walked down it, people from the ranches, tramps, which is like hobos, sort of homeless people who were traveling, who come down to be near water. And you can tell that a lot of people have spent time there because there's an ash pile where campfires were built, and the really low limb that's close to the ground, the branch that's close to the ground, is very smooth by how many people have sat on it. Okay, so I know people have been in this location pretty frequently, and so my expectation is that I'm going to see some people coming down this path pretty quickly. So let's go back. Evening of a hot day started the little wind to moving among the leaves. The shade climbed up the hills toward the top. On the sandbanks, the rabbits sat as quietly as little gray sculptured stones. And then from the direction of the state highway came the sound of footsteps on crisp sycamore leaves. The rabbits hurried noiselessly for cover. A stilted heron labored up into the air and pounded down the river. For a moment the place was lifeless, and then two men emerged from the path and came into the opening by the green pool. So in that paragraph, we sort of have nature retreating as men show up, right? As people come down these paths, the rabbits disappear, the heron, which is a bird, flies away. Okay. They had walked in single file down the path, and even in the open, one stayed behind the other. Both were dressed in denim trousers and in denim coats with brass buttons. Both wore black, shapeless hats, and both carried tight blanket rolls slung over their shoulders. The first man was small and quick, dark of face with restless eyes and sharp, strong features. Every part of him was defined: small, strong hands, slender arms, a thin and bony nose. Behind him walked his opposite, a huge man, shapeless of face, with large, pale eyes, with wide, sloping shoulders, and he walked heavily, dragging his feet a little, the way a bear drags his paws. His arms did not swing at his sides, but hung loosely. So here comes our first two characters, and we can tell a few things about them just by the way they walk down this path. First of all, they walk single file. That means one walks in front of the other, and even when they come into the opening, the second guy stays behind the big guy. So this tells me a little something, that the first guy is obviously the leader, right? The second guy is following the first guy very clearly. They're both dressed very similarly in denim, right? So they're working men, and what we know about context, we know that this is the Depression era. Jobs were hard to find, so these are guys who probably are looking for work a lot of their life. And they're carrying blanket rolls, so they're obviously on the move, which, again, what we know about the context, they're probably migrant workers. And then the descriptions of the men themselves. So the first guy is real small and sharp, right? Small, sharp, bony. And then the second guy is his opposite. Giant, huge, shapeless, right? He drags his feet, it says, like a bear. And his arms don't swing but kind of hang loosely. So if you kind of close your eyes, you can picture these two guys and what opposites they are. The first man stopped short in the clearing, and the follower nearly ran over him. He took off his hat, wiped the sweatband with his forefinger, and snapped the moisture off. His huge companion dropped his blankets and flung himself down and drank from the surface of the green pool, drank with long gulps, snorting into the water like a horse. The small man stepped nervously beside him. "Lenny," he said sharply. "Lenny, for God's sake, don't drink so much." Lenny continued to snort into the pool. The small man leaned over and shook him by the shoulder. "Lenny, you gonna be sick like you was last night." Lenny dipped his whole head under, hat and all, and then sat up on the bank, and his hat dripped down on his blue coat and ran down his back. "That's good," he said. "You drink some, George. You take a good big drink." And he smiled happily. George unslung his bindle and dropped it gently on the bank. "I ain't sure it's good water," he said. "Looks kind of scummy." Lenny dabbled his big paw in the water and wiggled his fingers so the water arose in little splashes. Rings widened across the pool to the other side and came back again. Lenny watched them go. "Look, George, look what I done." George knelt beside the pool and drank from his hand with quick scoops. "Tastes all right," he admitted. "Don't really seem to be running, though." "You never ought to drink water when it ain't running, Lenny," he said hopelessly. "You'd drink out of a gutter if you was thirsty." He threw a scoop of water into his face and rubbed it about with his hand under his chin and around the back of his neck. And then he replaced his hat, pushed himself back from the river, drew up his knees, and embraced them. Lenny, who had been watching, imitated George exactly. He pushed himself back, drew up his knees, embraced them, looked over to George to see whether he had it just right. He pulled his hat down a little more over his eyes, the way George's hat was. Okay, so now we get a little more information about these guys. We kind of see the dynamic between them, and their names are revealed. So the big guy's Lenny, and the little guy's George. And if we look at the descriptions of Lenny, again, they are completely opposite of the descriptions of George. Lenny throws his bundle down on the ground. He flops down on the ground in front of the pool and drinks straight out of the water like a horse, sort of snorting into the water. George puts his bindle down, gently. He is more cautious about the water. I don't know, looks kind of scummy. Maybe we shouldn't drink that, Lenny. You're going to get sick again like you did last night. And even in the way he drinks, George scoops the water in his hand, whereas Lenny just puts his face in it. Okay, and also George seems to be looking out for Lenny a little bit. Don't drink so much. You shouldn't drink water that ain't running, that kind of thing. So we definitely have, again, the leader and the follower. And a little bit of George seems smarter than Lenny. Also, Lenny is, he's like a little kid at this last bit here. He watches the way George sits, pulls his knees up, wraps his arms around his knees, and Lenny kind of watches him and then imitates him exactly. He wants to be just like George, just like a little kid. George stared morosely at the water. The rims of his eyes were red with sun glare. He said angrily, "We could just a well rode clear to the ranch if that bastard bus driver knew what he was talking about. Just a little stretch down the highway," he says. Just a little stretch. Goddamn near 4 miles, that's what it was. Didn't want to stop the ranch gate, that's what. Too goddamn lazy to pull up. Wonder he isn't too damn good to stop in Soledad at all. Kicks us out and says, just a little stretch down the road. I bet it was more than 4 miles. Damn hot day. So George is in a bad mood. He feels like the bus driver dropped them off too early and they had to walk on a hot day. Lenny looked timidly over to him. "George?" "Yeah, what you want?" "Where are we going, George?" The little man jerked down the brim of his hat and scowled over at Lenny. "So you forgot already, did you? I gotta tell you again, do I? Jesus Christ, you're a crazy bastard." "I forgot," Lenny said softly. "I tried not to forget. Honest to God I did, George." Okay, I'll tell you again. I ain't got nothing to do. Might just as well spend all my time telling you things and then you forget them and I tell you again. "Tried and tried," said Lenny, "but it didn't do no good. I remember about the rabbits, George." "The hell with the rabbits. That's all you can ever remember is them rabbits." "Okay, now you listen, and this time you got to remember so we don't get in no trouble. You remember sitting in that gutter on Howard Street and watching that blackboard?" So that's a reference to Depression era men looking for work. There were often these sort of public areas where a blackboard, like a chalkboard, would go up where people could post jobs. And the men often had to wait in line or wait for a long time for these jobs to show up. And then they would get work cards that would sort of be like their assignment to that job. Okay. Lenny's face broke into a delighted smile. "Why, sure, George, I remember that, but what do we do then? I remember some girls come by and you say, the hell with what I says. You remember about us going into Murray and Reddy's and they give us work cards and bus tickets." "Oh, sure, George, I remember that now." His hands went quickly into his side coat pockets. He said gently, "George, I ain't got mine. I must have lost it." He looked down at the ground in despair. "You never had none, you crazy bastard. I got both of them here." "Think I'd let you carry your own work card?" Lenny grinned with relief. I thought I put it in my side pocket." His hand went into the pocket again. George looked sharply at him. "What'd you take out of that pocket?" "Ain't a thing in my pocket," Lenny said cleverly. "I know there ain't. You got it in your hand. What you got in your hand hiding it?" "I ain't got nothing, George. Honest." "Come on, give it here." Lenny held his closed hand away from George's directions. "It's only a mouse, George." "A mouse? A live mouse?" Just a dead mouse, George. I didn't kill it, honest. I found it. I found it dead." "Give it here," said George. "Aw, leave me have it, George." "Give it here." Lenny's closed hand slowly obeyed. George took the mouse and threw it across the pool to the other side among the brush. "What you want of a dead mouse anyways?" "I could pet it with my thumb while we walked along," said Lenny. "Well, you ain't petting no mice while you walk with me. You remember where we're going now?" Lenny looked startled and then in embarrassment hid his face against his knees. "I forgot again." "Jesus Christ," George said resignedly. "Well, look, we're going to work on a ranch like the one we come from up north." "Up north?" "In Weed." "Oh, sure, I remember. In Weed. That ranch we're going to is right down there about a quarter mile. We're going to go in and see the boss. Now look, I'll give him the work tickets, but you ain't going to say a word. You just stand there and don't say nothing. If he finds out what a crazy bastard you are, we won't get no job. But if he sees you work before he hears you talk, we're set. You got that?" "Sure, George, sure. I got it." "Okay, now when we go in to see the boss, what are you going to do?" Lenny thought. His face grew tight with thought. I ain't gonna say nothing, just gonna stand there. Good boy, that's swell. You say that over 2-3 times, so you sure you won't forget. Lenny droned to himself softly. I ain't gonna say nothing. I ain't gonna say nothing. I ain't gonna say nothing. All right, so here we have a little more about George and Lenny. George is definitely the leader still, definitely the smarter one, and seems like a bit of a parent, right? If you haven't figured out already, Lenny does have a cognitive disability, okay? So he does have a mental disability. He's like a child. He obviously likes to pet soft things. He's been carrying this dead mouse in his pocket, which George, like a parent, takes away from him. And George has to remind him, because Lenny forgets a lot, where they're going. And they're going to find work. They're going to a ranch. They have work cards. They're expected there. And George warns Lenny pretty severely, don't you dare talk. You let me do the talking when we get in there, because if the boss hears you talk, he may not give us the job. And the reason is George knows that Lenny's disability is pretty obvious once you start talking to Lenny. And he's concerned that the boss will be discriminatory and will not want someone like him working on his ranch. But George says, but if he sees you work before he hears you talk, we're set. Because of Lenny's size, he's just this giant, huge, strong man. He's probably a really good worker on a farm. Okay. Okay, said George, and you ain't gonna do no bad things like you done in Weed, neither. Lenny looks puzzled. Like I done in Weed? Oh, so you forgot that too, did you? Well, I ain't gonna remind you. Fear you do it again. A light of understanding broke on Lenny's face. They run us out of Weed, he exploded triumphantly. Run us out, hell, said George disgustedly. We run. They was looking for us, but they didn't catch us. Lenny giggled happily. I didn't forget that, you bet. Okay, so there's some reference there to Lenny got them into some sort of trouble in the last town they were in, to the point where people were running them out of town, chasing them out of town. George lay back on the sand and crossed his hands under his head, and Lenny imitated him, raising his head to see whether he was doing it right. God, you're a lot of trouble, said George. I could get along so easy and so nice if I didn't have you on my tail. I could live so easy and maybe have a girl. For a moment, Lenny lay quiet. And then he said hopefully, we gonna work on a ranch, George? All right, you got that. But we're gonna sleep here because I got a reason. The day was going fast now. Only the tops of the Gavilan Mountains flamed with the light of the sun that had gone from the valley. A water snake slipped along in the pool, its head held up like a little periscope. The reeds jerked slightly in the current. Far off toward the highway, a man shouted something, and another man shouted back. The sycamore limbs rustled under a little wind that died immediately. So there's another sort of peaceful moment. George decides instead of heading to the ranch tonight, they're going to spend the night here in this little natural, peaceful spot. George, why ain't we going on to the ranch and get some supper? George, why ain't we going on to the ranch and get some supper? They got supper at the ranch. George rolled on his side. No reason at all for you. I like it here. Tomorrow we're going to go to work. I seen thrashing machines on the way down. That means we'll be bucking grain bags, busting a gut. Tonight I'm going to lay right here and look up. I like it. So George has a reason. He says we're going to work soon enough, right? And it's going to be hard work. Bucking grain bags means picking up these huge, heavy bags of grain and tossing them onto a truck. It's a lot of hard work. And he wants to just stay there for the night. Lenny got up on his knees and looked down at George. Ain't we going to have no supper? Sure we are. If you gather up some dead willow sticks, I got 3 cans of beans in my bindle. You get a fire ready. I'll give you a match when you get the sticks together. Then we'll heat the beans and have supper. Lenny said, I like beans with ketchup. Well, we ain't got no ketchup. You go get wood and don't fool around. It'll be dark before long. Lenny lumbered to his feet and disappeared in the brush. George lay where he was and whistled softly to himself. There were sounds of splashings down the river in the direction Lenny had taken. George stopped whistling and listened. Poor bastard, he said softly, and then went on whistling again. In a moment, Lenny came crashing back through the brush. He carried one small willow stick in his hand. George sat up. "All right," he said brusquely. "Give me that mouse." George held out his hand. "Come on." Oh, I'm sorry. But Lenny made an elaborate pantomime of innocent. "What mouse, George? I ain't got no mouse." George held out his hand. "Come on, give it to me. You ain't putting nothing over." Lenny hesitated, backed away, looked wildly at the brush line as though he contemplated running for his freedom. George said coldly, "You gonna give me that mouse or do I have to sock you?" "Give you what, George?" "You know goddamn well what. I want that mouse." Lenny reluctantly reached into his pocket. His voice broke a little. "I don't know why I can't keep it. It ain't nobody's mouse. I didn't steal it. I found it lying right beside the road." George's hand remained outstretched imperiously. Slowly, like a terrier who doesn't want to bring a ball to its master, Lenny approached, drew back, approached again. George snapped his fingers sharply, and at the sound, Lenny laid the mouse in his hand. "I wasn't doing nothing bad with it, George, just stroking it." George stood up and threw the mouse as far as he could into the darkening brush, and then he stepped to the pool and washed his hands. "You crazy fool. Don't you think I could see your feet was wet where you went across the river to get it?" He heard Lenny's whimpering and cry and wheeled about. "Blubbering like a baby, Jesus Christ. Big guy like you." Lenny's lip quivered and tears started in his eyes. "Oh, Lenny." George put his hand on Lenny's shoulders. "I ain't taking it away just for meanness. That mouse ain't fresh, Lenny. And besides, you broke it petting it. You get another mouse that's fresh and I'll let you keep it a little while." Lenny sat down on the ground and hung his head dejectedly. "I don't know where there is no other mouse. I remember a lady used to give 'em to me. Everyone she got. But that lady ain't here." George scoffed. "Lady, huh? Don't even remember who that lady was. That was your own Aunt Clara. When she stopped giving 'em to you always killed 'em." Lenny looked sadly up at him. "They was so little," he said apologetically. "I'd pet 'em, and pretty soon they bit my fingers, and I pinched their little heads a little, and then they was dead. Because they was so little." "I wished we'd get the rabbits pretty soon, George. They ain't so little." "The hell with the rabbits. And you ain't to be trusted with no live mice. Your Aunt Clara give you a rubber mouse, and you wouldn't have nothing to do with it." "It wasn't no good to pet," said Lenny. All right, so he is just like a little kid, right? And he's sort of got this fixation with petting soft things. And George is harsh with him, but you can also see this compassion, right? When Lenny starts to cry, he's like, "Oh, Lenny, I'm not trying to just be mean. I'm looking out for you. If we find you a fresh one, you can keep it for a while." And then we learn that Lenny, his memory really is a part of his disability. He can't remember his own Aunt Clara. He calls her that lady who used to give me the mice. But he does remember these rabbits. This is now the second or third time that Lenny has said, "I remember the rabbits. When are we going to get the rabbits?" Okay. The flame of the sunset lifted from the mountaintops, and dusk came into the valley, and a half-darkness came in among the willows and the sycamores. It's getting dark now. A big carp rose to the surface of the pool, gulped air, and then sank mysteriously into the dark water again, leaving widening rings on the water. Overhead, the leaves whisked again, and little puffs of willow cotton blew down and landed on the pool's surface. So again, we get this little sort of peaceful moment of just nature doing its thing. "You gonna get that wood?" George demanded. "There's plenty right up against the back of that sycamore. Floodwater wood. Now you get it." Lenny went behind the tree and brought out a litter of dried leaves and twigs. He threw them in a heap on the old ash pile and went back for more and more. It was almost night now. A dove's wings whistled over the water. George walked to the fire pile and lighted the dry leaves. The flame cracked up among the twigs and fell to work. George undid his bindle and brought out 3 cans of beans. He stood them about the fire, close in against the blaze, but not quite touching the flame. "There's enough beans for 4 men, George said. Lenny watched him from over the fire. He said patiently, "I like 'em with ketchup." "Well, we ain't got any," George exploded. "Whatever we ain't got, that's what you want. God almighty, if I was alone, I could live so easy. I could go get a job and work and no trouble, no mess at all. And when the end of the month come, I could take my $50 and go into town and get whatever I want. Why, I could stay in a cat house all night. I could eat any place I want, hotel or any place, and order any damn thing I could think of. And I could do all that every damn month. get a gallon of whiskey or sit in a pool room and play cards or shoot pool. Lenny knelt and looked over the fire at the angry George, and Lenny's face was drawn with terror. "And what I got," George went on furiously, "I got you. You can't keep a job and you lose me every job I get. Just keeping me shoving all over the country all the time. And that ain't the worst. You get in trouble. You do bad things and I gotta get you out." His voice rose nearly to a shout. "You crazy son of a bitch. You keep me in hot water all the time." He took on the elaborate manner of little girls when they're mimicking one another. "Just want to feel that girl's dress. Just want to pet it like it was a mouse. Well, how the hell did she know you just want to feel her dress? She jerks back and you hold on to it like it's a mouse, and she yells and we got to hide in an irrigation ditch all day with guys looking for us, and we got to sneak out in the dark and get out of the country. All the time something like that. All the time. I wished I could put you in a cage with about 1,000,000 mice and let you have fun." His anger left him suddenly. He looked across the fire at Lenny's anguished face, and then he looked ashamedly at the flames. So George kind of loses it here, right? He just explodes on Lenny with the pressure of having to take care of him. He imagines what his life would be like if he didn't have Lenny. He could make his money, he could spend it on anything he wanted. Why, I could stay in a cat house all night. That's a whorehouse. Okay, he could eat wherever he wants, but what do I got? I got you, and you lose me every job, and you make trouble. And then he gets real specific about the kind of trouble he gets into, which is probably what got them run out of weed, is that he says, Lenny just wanted to feel that girl's dress, right? So he grabs onto some girl's dress. She tries to pull back. Lenny holds on because he doesn't understand the situation. She starts screaming, and all of a sudden they're wanted. People are chasing them down, okay? But in the middle of this explosion, George looks across the fire and he sees Lenny's face. 2 places it says his face was drawn with terror at Lenny's anguished face. And suddenly his anger disappears and he's ashamed of himself. It was quite dark now, but the fire lighted the trunks of the trees and the curving branches overhead. Lenny crawled slowly and cautiously around the fire until he was close to George. He sat back on his heels. George turned the bean can so the other side faced the fire. He pretended to be unaware of Lenny so close beside him. "George," very softly. No answer. "George, what do you want?" "I was only fooling, George. I don't want no ketchup. I wouldn't eat no ketchup if it was right here beside me." "If it was here, you could have some. But I wouldn't eat none, George. I'd leave it all for you. You could cover your beans with it, and I wouldn't touch none of it." So here you have Lenny in his sort of not understanding way trying to apologize to George. He thinks the ketchup thing is what set George off. And so he's very sweetly trying to make peace. I don't want no ketchup, George. In fact, if we had some, you could have all of it." George still stared morosely at the fire. "When I think of the swell time I could have without you, I go nuts. I never get no peace." Lenny still knelt. He looked off into the darkness across the river. "George, you want I should go away and leave you alone? Where the hell would you go?" "Well, I could go off in the hills there. Some place I'd find a cave." "Yeah? How'd you eat? You ain't got sense enough to find nothing to eat." "I'd find things, George. I don't need no nice food with ketchup. I'd lay out in the sun and nobody'd hurt me. And if I found a mouse, I could keep it. Nobody'd take it away from me." George looked quickly and searchingly at him. "I've been mean, ain't I?" "If you don't want me, I can go off in the hills and find a cave. I can go away any time." "No, look, I was just fooling, Lenny, 'cause I want you to stay with me. Trouble with mice is you always kill 'em." He paused. "Tell you what I'll do, Lenny. First chance I get, I'll give you a pup. Maybe you wouldn't kill it. That'd be better than mice, and you could pet it harder." Lenny avoided the bait. He had sensed his advantage. So Lenny, in his way, is sort of combating back like, "Okay, George, if you don't want me, I'll go off and leave. I can live better too. I can have mice and nobody will take them away from me. Lenny avoided the bait. He had sensed his advantage. If you don't want me, you only just got to say so, and I'll go off in those hills right there. Right up in those hills and live by myself, and I won't get no mice stole from me. George said, I want you to stay with me, Lenny. Jesus Christ, somebody'd shoot you for a coyote if you was by yourself. No, you stay with me. Your Aunt Clara wouldn't like you running off by yourself, even if she is dead. Lenny spoke craftily. Tell me, like you done before. Tell you what? About the rabbits? George snapped. You ain't gonna put nothing over on me. Lenny pleaded. Come on, George, tell me. Please, George, like you done before. You get a kick out of that, don't you? All right, I'll tell you, and then we'll eat our supper. George's voice became deeper. He repeated his words rhythmically, as though he had said them many times before. Guys like us that work on ranches are the loneliest guys in the world. They got no family. They don't belong no place. They come to a ranch and work up a stake, and then they go into town and blow their stake, and the first thing you know, they're pounding their tail on some other ranch. They ain't got nothing to look ahead to. Lenny was delighted. That's it. Now tell how it is with us. George went on. With us, it ain't like that. We got a future. We got somebody to talk to that gives a damn about us. We don't have to sit in no bar room blowing our jack just 'cause we got no place else to go. If them other guys gets in jail, they can rot for all anybody gives a damn. But not us. Lenny broke in. But not us. And why? Because I got you to look after me, and you got me to look after you. That's why. He laughed delightedly. Go on now, George. You got it by heart. You can do it yourself. No, you. I forget some of the things. Tell about how it's going to be. Okay. Someday, we're going to get the jack together, and we're going to have a little house and a couple acres and a cow and some pigs and live off the fat of the land, Lenny shouted, and have rabbits. Go on, George, tell about what we're going to have in the garden, about the rabbits and the cages, and about the rain in the winter and the stove, and how thick the cream is on the milk, like you can hardly cut it. Tell about that, George. Why don't you do it yourself? You know all of it. No, you tell it. It ain't the same if I tell it. Go on, George. How I get to tend the rabbits? Well, said George, we'll have a big vegetable patch and a rabbit hutch and chickens. And when it rains in the winter, we'll just say the hell with going to work, and we'll build up a fire in the stove and sit around and listen to the rain coming down on the roof. Nuts. He took out his pocket knife. I ain't got time for no more. He drove his knife through the top of one of the bean cans, sawed out the top, and passed the can to Lenny. Then he opened a second can. From his side pocket, he brought out 2 spoons and passed one of them to Lenny. They sat by the fire and filled their mouths with beans and chewed mightily. A few beans slipped out of the side of Lenny's mouth. George gestured with his spoon. What you gonna say tomorrow when the boss asks you questions? Lenny stopped chewing and swallowed. His face was concentrated. I ain't gonna say a word. Good boy, that's fine, Lenny. Maybe you're getting better. When we get the couple of acres, I can let you tend the rabbits all right, especially if you remember as good as that. Lenny choked with pride. I can remember, he said. George motioned with the spoon again. Look, Lenny, I want you to look around here. You can remember this place, can't you? The ranch is about a quarter mile up that way. Just follow the river. Sure, said Lenny, I can remember. Didn't I remember about not going to say a word? Of course you did. Well, look, Lenny, if you just happen to get in trouble like you always done before, I want you to come right here and hide in the brush. Hide in the brush, said Lenny slowly. Hide in the brush till I come for you. Can you remember that? Sure I can, George. Hide in the brush till you come. But you ain't gonna get in no trouble, because if you do, I won't let you tend the rabbits. He threw his empty bean can off into the brush. I won't get in no trouble, George. I ain't gonna say a word. Okay, bring your bindle over here by the fire. It's gonna be nice sleeping here, looking up in the leaves. Don't build up no more fire. We'll let her die down. They made their beds on the sand, and as the blaze dropped from the fire, the sphere of light grew smaller. The curling branches disappeared, and only a faint glimmer showed where the tree trunks were. From the darkness, Lenny called, George, you asleep? No, what do you want? Let's have different color rabbits, George. Sure we will, said George sleepily. Red and blue, green rabbits, Lenny. Millions of them. Furry ones, George, like I seen in the fair in Sacramento. Sure, furry ones. 'Cause I can just as well go away, George, and live in a cave. You can just as well go to hell, said George. Shut up now. The red light dimmed on the coals. Up the hill from the river, a coyote yammered, and a dog answered from the other side of the stream. The sycamore leaves whispered in a little night breeze. All right, so we got a couple of important things happening. First of all, this dream, this story that George tells that he clearly has told before. It says a couple of times. He repeated his words rhythmically as though he'd said them many times. It's almost, and Lenny, who remembers nothing, remembers so much of this story as well. And what is it? It's their dream for the future. And it's not a glamorous dream. It's we want a little place for ourselves. We want to work for ourselves. We want to have a few vegetables and some chickens and decide whether we're going to work on a rainy day or not, right? So it's a very simple sort of dream. And of course, the most important part of it for Lenny is the rabbits. Tell about the rabbits, George. And that he gets to take care of the rabbits, right? And you can see, Lenny loves hearing about it. And even though George is a little grumpy about it, you can tell George likes telling about it. And then here at the end, George makes Lenny remember the place they are right now. He says, can you remember this spot? Can you remember where this is? If you just follow the river from the ranch, if you get in any trouble, you come here and you hide and you wait for me, okay? So George knows Lenny's tendencies, and he's trying to make a safety plan here, that in case there is trouble, he tells Lenny, come back to this spot and hide and wait for me until I come for you. That's foreshadowing. That's a hint to the reader about something that's going to happen in the future. Why would a character say something like that if it wasn't going to matter later? All right, so that's chapter 1. We'll continue next time with chapter 2 when Lenny and George get to the ranch. Thanks for watching.